My guest today is somebody whose career has trodden a portfolio path, but whatever the role, communication and empathy have always been at the core. Bill Laughey trained and worked as a GP, spending years on the front line of patient care before transitioning into roles that sit at the very intersection of medicine, evidence, and the broader healthcare ecosystem. He's had a long association with NHS England and, like me, studied at the University of York, which is where we actually met at Hull York Medical School. Bill has spent over 2 decades thinking deeply about how medical evidence is generated, communicated, and also experienced, whether that be from his time as a GP trainer and partner in York to leading clinical research to now serving as medical director for evidence and strategy and engagement at Reckitt, where he works on self-care medicine. He's also been a television doctor, a GP trainer, and for 15 years been the clinical director in health professions education at the University of York. What strikes me most about Bill's journey is that it mirrors something I think many clinicians experience, that slow realization that the system around patients matters just as much as that precious doctor-patient consultation itself. And that's exactly why I wanted to bring him on and into this conversation about empathy and AI, because he's somebody who's never lost sight of the human at the center of it all. Bill, thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks, Kish. That was a very nice intro. I appreciate it. Thank you.
No worries, every word. And having worked with you for many years, I'm super excited about this conversation. So tell us, actually, before we jump straight into AI, because that's almost what everybody wants to talk about. Let's just, maybe you could ground our audience in your research that you did around empathy and doctor-patient communication.
Yeah, thanks, Kish. You're absolutely right. So you're right in saying we've both trodden a very similar path in medical education, Kish. That's where a lot of our research has happened. And for me, because I was involved in teaching a lot at York University, I started getting qualifications in medical education. And when I got to the master's level, I did a dissertation about what makes a good medical communicator. And I asked actors who pretend to be patients, simulated patients, they're called in medical education, aren't they, Kish? Because these actors spend a lot of time with medical students and other clinical students, teaching them communication skills and giving them practice. And I asked them, what do you think makes a good medical communicator? It was a piece of qualitative research, Kish.
Yeah.
The number one thing that came out time and time again were two words: listening and empathy. Lots of other things came out: eye contact, confidence, all of these things. Being human, that term came up time and time again. But it got me really interested in empathy because it had come up so often. And I went on to do a PhD by publication, trying to really understand what actually is empathy in the clinical context, Kish, and how are we teaching it?
And what were I'm sure our viewers, listeners will have a idea of what empathy means to them in a clinical consultation. But from your perspective, what if you could encapsulate that and summarize that in terms of some of the qualitative quotes and things that came out of the research? Because I know you said about listening and eye contact and being human, but are there any real practical examples that really have stayed in your memory?
Yes. Kish, the image that came up time and time again when you asked medical students in particular what they thought empathy was, is they described usually a situation. So it was usually something like a ward round, and it was a senior clinician on a ward round, a busy ward round in the middle of a busy day, recognizing that a patient, it might be, say, an elderly patient looking quite worried in bed, needs extra time. And this image of that clinician taking time to kneel down at the bedside, get to that eye level, and just give some understanding and some time and do a bit of explaining to this frightened patient. And time again, that image would come up. And there was something very non-verbal about it, Kish. There was something about that, just the eye contact, the listening, the giving time, the trying to understand. And there was a very strong message about what empathy isn't. And what empathy isn't to those students is making a very quick empathic statement, what's known in medical education as the empathic statement, which is usually, I'm sorry to hear that. And it's a sort of automatic response to hearing the patient saying something a bit distressing. And the student says, I'm sorry to hear that, for which they get a mark in a clinical exam for saying that. But which, if it doesn't come from any sincere place, isn't empathy, Kish. Some people kindly call it cognitive empathy, but actually, when you really drill down, it's more of a substitute for empathy. And a lot of my PhD was about that. It was about how can we try to avoid these substitutes for empathy creeping into the busy clinical practice. So, because, as you rightly said, the system in which you work can sometimes dictate how much time you have for compassion and caring.
No, for sure. And I think there's 2 points on that. I think, look, healthcare systems around the world are under strain and are struggling, and that's almost a separate topic in itself. But I think when you said about you get a point on a checklist for saying that statement, it makes me think as an educator as well, we're responsible for that, aren't we? We're creating a system like the other classic one was ideas, concerns, expectations. And I can remember, not that I've examined students for a few years now, but when I was examining them, I can remember the ones that would just go through the motions and randomly at a point in their head say, what are your ideas? What are your expectations? What are your concerns? It was really interesting for me to see that, and it was a mix of both simulated patients and actual real patients that were coming in for exams. But the response was uniform in the sense that the ones that asked it from the heart got a really authentic, genuine, meaningful answer that actually helped progress that doctor-patient conversation. And the ones that asked it from the head and a checklist, almost like a reflex, got at times quite a flippant, what do you think what brought you here today? The bus? Or why do you think I'm here? And for me, it was really interesting to see that was both the simulated patients, but also the actual patients that we were bringing in.
It is such a good point, Kish. In Hull York Medical School, we wrote a short paper about that in a journal called Medical Education. And we called it When I Say Empathic Dissonance. This whole thing was about defining terms in medical education. And we defined empathic dissonance as the discomfort that people, particularly students, feel when they feel forced into saying something empathic, even though they know they don't mean it, as, for example, often happens in clinical examinations. In that short paper, we imagined a world a little bit like the Blade Runner world, where you have replicants who look like humans, but are not actually human, they're androids. And we imagined putting some of those into a clinical examination and some real medical students into a clinical examination. And the problem is the way that we do our clinical examinations in medicine, the androids would very likely score just as well as the real humans, Kish, because they'd be just as good at saying, I'm sorry to hear that. That must be very difficult for you. And they'd know when to say it because they could recognize certain emotional cues in a person, and they would think, this is time now for my empathic statement. But the difference between those two groups of people is that because the computers, the androids, the replicants are dark inside, they would say it without any compunction or conscience or worry about it. The humans say it knowing they're saying a lie, and it's uncomfortable for them. It causes some dissonance, and it's one of the problems with encouraging that kind of empathy, that sort of head empathy, as you termed it, Kish. It ultimately takes away from the real condition of empathy.
No, thank you. That's really interesting. And it leads us nicely to empathy in the age of AI and these chatbots and these large language models that are essentially mimicking the way that humans interact and use language, and then regenerate or regurgitate things on a probabilistic frame in terms of how they've seen things happen in the past and being trained on the entirety of human knowledge. So the roles that these chatbots and large language models are having is whether they be friends, lovers, therapists, even death bots are being talked about. So I'd love to get your perspective as somebody who is, I would deem, an expert in empathy between doctor and patient. Do we see from an artificial intelligence, are there positives? Are there negatives? What are you optimistic about the future here, or are you thinking, hold on a minute, what on earth are we doing?
So for me, Kish, it is more that last one that you just said. I look back at some of the really iconic classical research in AI that happened, I think, in about the 80s. And I came across a paper by somebody called Searle, and it was a thought experiment, Kish. And it was called, I don't know if you've come across it, but it was called the Chinese room experiment. And what it imagined is that two English-speaking people go to China with a huge manual that allows them to give responses in the Chinese language. And then a group of Chinese people can come into a room, there's a little letterbox in the room, and they can pass little notes through to the English people in the other room. These notes are written in Chinese. The English people in the other room then get this massive manual out. They look at all the symbols on the paper. They find the bit in the manual that gives a response to those symbols. And they write the symbols down from the manual and pass that bit of paper back through into the room to the Chinese people. The Chinese people look at it and think, that makes perfect sense. There's some very clever people on the other side of this little post box here. Of course, the problem is those English people don't understand a word of the Chinese language. They have no concept of the Chinese language, Kish, and yet they are able, because of this massive manual they've got, to give convincing symbols back through this letterbox. And for me, that's where we are with things like AI, whether it's ChatGPT on here. I know other people have Claude. I know there are others. But really, when you really ask yourself about empathy, like, why did empathy evolve in humans is a really important question, Kish. It's actually evolved in other mammals as well. And it evolved for most things in evolution to help us survive without being able to put ourselves in somebody else's story. It's difficult to care for another person. Mammals are not like reptiles. They don't lay hundreds of eggs and leave the scene. A mammal gives birth and then prioritizes their young, looks after them, puts their care ahead of the parents' care. And the other thing that humans have done going back in evolution is they've worked together in teams as hunter-gatherers. They've been pro-social, and empathy allows for that. So there's something extremely human about empathy, Kish. But empathy begins with what is generally termed emotional resonance. So it's you're in conversation with somebody and there's something that they say, or more often than not, it's a facial gesture or it's a look. And you suddenly find yourself crossing over to them because you really can feel that you're in their story for that minute. Now, to do that, I could do that with you, Kish, because we've had similar experiences through our lives. We've gone to school for the first time. We've done assessments. We've hurt ourselves and experienced pain and cried because of it. We've laughed with friends. We understand human experience. But I can't think that something on here understands human experience in the same way. It might be able to give representations of that back through the letterbox, but it hasn't lived it like we've lived it, Kish. And ultimately, I think that's why empathy is something it will never be able to do if we accept a more holistic view of what empathy is.
It's a mimic in one regard, then, in the sense that it, and I think, I'm not sure whether this one, I got this in preparation for today's chat. I haven't read it all yet. Like many books, I just flick through them, look for ideas. I love books, but I struggle as a dyslexic to get through them all. But one of the things that this book was talking about, which I found really interesting, was it's this bit, code dependent. And there's something about physical media and the physical form, right? Where I just picked up this book and I know exactly the weight and where it is. And I just opened exactly the page where I want it to be, right? And it was saying, there are concerns that stem from the unpredictable nature of this technology. These apps create deep emotional connections, But when there are glitches or errors, users can find themselves vulnerable. The issue lies in the fact that companies cannot fully control or predict what AI characters might say. Powered by probabilistic language models, these systems generate responses based on, as we were talking about, statistical patterns rather than set scripts. And while wild hallucinations are rare, certainly from my perspective as a physician, first and foremost, if millions, if not billions of people around the world are using these tools, the margin for safety that we have to have has to be so high, because even if it's a fraction of a percent, the sheer numbers of people putting their information, putting their life into these models, especially when they're vulnerable. It's one thing asking for directions or asking for a recipe or holiday ideas, but when it's dealing with health and the human condition, because there have been cases where people have come to significant and serious harm and or lost their lives as a result of interacting with these models. So I know that was a bit of a long monologue and there wasn't really a question there, but what are your thoughts?
I completely agree. I think this is, again, going back to some of this classical research, Kish, there was, I've forgotten his name, but one of the researchers in this field, he was working back in the 1970s, and his program was called the ELIZA program, ELIZA. It was essentially one of the very first chatbots. And what he recognized, and he wrote a book about this, but he recognized this in his work. He recognized that humans, even though these must have been pretty rudimentary chatbots back in the 1970s, he recognized that what humans were very quick to do was to ascribe human personalities to his chatbots, to endow upon them the imagination that they must be consciousness, that there must be another consciousness here, there must be a personality behind this, when in fact it was a very rudimentary pattern recognition chatbot. And he called that the ELIZA effect. And I think it's a human frailty that we have, Kish, that we'll do it with animals as well. We'll assume that our dog understands us, and probably most of the time our dog doesn't understand us.
Definitely,
so it is a human frailty. And it comes back, for me, it comes back to, I think, what you were saying, Kish, about the head and the heart. Now, I learned this in my PhD Viva, actually. So my PhD Viva, one of the people that Vivaed me was called Stuart Mercer. He's an amazing clinician, GP by background, professor in Edinburgh. And he developed something called the CARE survey, or the CARE questionnaire. And it's a way of looking for empathy in the clinician. Patients fill it in, which is a good thing. It's patients deciding on whether a clinician is empathic. And Stuart was looking at all the papers I'd written, and he said to me, I think there's something here that you've fundamentally misunderstood, which I knew meant I'd need a bit of a rewrite, by the way, Kish, but that was all right. But he said, you're calling something cognitive empathy here, the bit that we were talking about when there was no real meaning behind it, no real human experience or heart being brought into the equation. He said, that's not cognitive empathy. Whatever that is, it's not empathy. He said, we do need cognitions for empathy, but he said empathy is made up of two things. The first is emotional resonance. So it's when you're with another person and you really get what they're saying. Carl Rogers described it as almost being able to be inside that person and understand the way that they're feeling, almost sharing their feelings, but still knowing you're not them. And he said that's the emotional part of empathy. There's a neurology to that, and it's the older part of our brain. It happens very quickly. It's a bit like system one thinking. And he said then what happens is you start to take the perspective of the other person. So you suddenly start to think, this is somebody that's very upset here, and it sounds like they're really struggling at work, for example. Then the cognitive part kicks in. You start to put yourself in their shoes and think, okay, can I problem solve for them here? Is it that they need some advice? Do they need some time away from work? What kind of things might be helping here? Now, that's a little bit slower, it takes a little bit more deliberate thinking. But for him, empathy was both of those things happening together, an emotional component that comes from you being human and being able to resonate with another person, and then a cognitive component that perhaps helps you decide how to respond to them. But if you don't have that first part, that part that comes from the human experience, Kish, then you don't really have empathy, because cognitive empathy is not empathy. It's a substitute, it's something else. But it's that something else that I think AI can do. It's not coming from human experience, but it can send representations of social manners and say it's sorry to hear that and all of those things. And then we can give too much emphasis to that. I think that's the danger, Kish.
Thank you. And I've got a quick question for you then. I think, and this isn't even related to AI per se, it's more related to phones and how we're constantly glued to them. Do you think we're losing human connection in terms of, the thing that popped into my mind was the number of dinners or going out for a restaurant where people are sat there on their phones, not talking to the people in front of them. So are we losing something fundamental in terms of how we connect with one another because we're almost too engaged or too hooked on these devices?
I think that's right. I think there's something special about, I'm not saying that you can't do empathy in a situation like this, where you can see gestures that the person's making. You can read the body language on their face and hear their words and hear their tone of voice. I think that's closer to being in a room with somebody. I think reading a text that somebody sent to you is further away from that. You lose a lot of the subtleties of non-verbal expression there. And we know non-verbal expression is crucial for emotional expression. But I think as humans, Kish, we are basically pro-social animals. We evolved empathy for the survival of our species, and empathy is about connections with other people. And if we're not connecting with other people, we become lonely. And loneliness is a big health risk, isn't it, Kish? Especially as people get older. It's one of the biggest health risks in terms of the pillars of good health, things like good nutrition, physical exercise. Well, social connection is one of them, and loneliness is associated with poor health outcomes. So I couldn't agree more.
No, thank you. And something that popped up in my head while you were talking there was last week I was on as a guest on James Somaru's Health Tech podcast. And he made a comment about phones, which has probably triggered this question, right? He goes, we're at the stage where we were with tobacco many years ago, where people were saying that smoking is healthy. And our children and our grandchildren are probably going to look at us and say, what, you had completely unrestricted, unfettered access to social media? Are you mad? And this is something that I've thought deeply about, because banning it for me is I just don't understand. It's not going to go away. And almost by stopping children grappling with it and learning it and understanding the world that they're going into, that's giving them a massive disadvantage. But I did find that point quite interesting about innovation. We're in this almost warp speed of innovation. It's going so quickly, regulation can't keep up. So it's up to us as individuals, professionally and personally, to have these conversations and really think about the impact these technologies have on our lives.
It's such a rapid change, isn't it, Kish? Evolution can't keep up with these kind of things. The way our brains are wired is obviously way behind the way that these are trying to catch our attention. I did a park run on Saturday, Kish, and it's a 5K run, a very common thing in the United Kingdom. And I was walking away from it with lots of other runners. And I noticed, and I was one of them, I noticed a lot of people were walking with their phones in their hand, probably most people. And I thought back to when I was at university, which was just before really mobile phones came out. And I thought, do you know, if I could have just looked 30 years into the future, walking away from a running event, I'd be really interested to know what these things were that every single person seems to have in their hand.
Yeah.
But it has been, quite a rapid change, I think, for society, Kish.
Yeah. And so I've got a quick question for you then. So what would your message be to two audiences, really? Members of the public that might be thinking of or using these kind of tools and technologies, but also what would your message be to the next generation of doctors, nurses, healthcare professionals out there that no doubt these tools are going to change the practice of medicine, but I think we've got two very distinct audiences there. So what would your messages be to those two groups?
Yes, I think for the clinicians, Kish, I think I would be saying to them, the thing that is going to save your jobs in many ways, the thing that separates you from AI, because I'm pretty sure AI will get extremely good at interpreting blood results and tests and probably listening to histories and having a pretty good shot at differential diagnoses. I'm sure it'll get very good at that. But it will never have that human touch. And that's what empathy ultimately is. And it's that ability to realize when somebody needs a little bit of time and a little bit of an explanation and a bit of compassionate curiosity, asking some questions that help the person get their story out. Because getting somebody's history out isn't a matter of just flashing something in a text in front of them. You sometimes have to tease it out and make a connection. So I think empathy is something that's really worth studying and learning about and understanding and realizing the difference between statements that do not come from a really human place. And as you said at the very beginning of this, something that comes from a genuine place because you've actually felt affected by listening to what somebody has said to you. So for me, that's why clinicians will always be needed as human beings, and it separates us from AI. I'm pretty sure AI is going to help us to get better at diagnosing people and deciding how to investigate people and all of those things.
Yeah.
But it will not help us get better at empathy. That is something, it might give us more time for it, Kish, and that would be good if it does. That would be really good. And I've forgotten what your other question was. I'm sorry, Kish.
Members of the public using these tools and technologies, and because I can certainly relate and understand if you can't see a GP or you can't see a healthcare professional and you don't have doctors in the family or you're not medically trained, then I can 100% understand why people would go to Google, go to ChatGPT, go to Claude, go to whatever. But I'm not entirely sure whether. And I know they're not, because my mum the other day, she said she Googled something, or she checked with AI. I was like, what AI did you use? And she goes, I Googled it. I was like, okay, so you use Gemini or automatically on top of that. So the people, there's a journey and there's a curve and there's a development. So just from your perspective, what do you think members of the public should be keeping in mind when they're interacting and engaging with these tools? Which, don't get me wrong, they're very good and they add lots of benefits, but also some of the potential pitfalls that people can be guarding against.
Yeah, absolutely, Kish. And I agree with you. It would be pretty crazy to think that people wouldn't go to these tools, because this is where knowledge is, and this can distill knowledge and all of those things. But, and I think there is a but here, Kish, they can lead you down the wrong path sometimes. They do get things wrong. And the difficulty is, for me, I've noticed this when I've been researching things. Sometimes you can be in an area where there's not a lot known about the subject, and it can give the impression that it's pretty certain what the answer is. And then when you look at the references and you start to look at what the evidence is behind the certainty that ChatGPT, for example, sometimes tells me, Kish, I'm thinking, actually, I've now realized that's not based on a very solid evidence base. So again, it might sometimes raise the alert for you to get medical advice, but to me, it should never replace getting experienced medical advice. I think also be aware it could raise a lot of false alarms and false worries. We've always known that with Dr. Google, haven't we? We've always said people come fearing the worst because you can quite quickly reach the very worst case scenarios when you start searching online with your symptoms. So I think it's just trying to balance those things, Kish. Like you, I agree there can be helpful advice from it, but I think there's always that caution in my mind. It never replaces that individual health advice you can get from talking to somebody who's an experienced healthcare professional.
Yeah, no, for sure. Bill, thank you so much for your time. I'd love to have you back on, and I'm sure this is a topic that is going to run and run as these tools evolve, as they get better. There's always going to be nuances, and there's always going to be developments. So, yeah, I really enjoyed our conversation, and thank you so much for your time.
Oh, Kish, I really enjoyed our conversation as well, and I think it's a really important topic as well. I'm really pleased that you're doing this, Kish. Thank you.
Thanks.
Okay.